By the edge of the sea, by the mouth of the river, there was a girl who lived not so very far away from all of the trees. Now, she wasn't the tallest girl in all of this world, but she was one who would not wait for a second to reach with her hands and take anything that she could. Now, she saw that there was a basket that was resting by the edge of a muddy path. This girl thought to herself that without waiting for a second, she would take everything that she could. She would take it all, without wishing or waiting to find out who it belonged to. Inside of the basket there were packets of seeds. Inside of the basket there were carrots. There were potatoes. There was fruit. And she took everything out of the basket and stuffed it into her pockets and felt very proud of herself that she had stolen so many things. But all of the fruit and all of the vegetables belonged to a witch. Now, this witch did not really know that many spells, but when she saw that everything was gone, she looked all about her. She saw that her carrots were gone. She saw that her potatoes were gone. And the girl, who was very happy, munching upon a huge, round, crunchy carrot, didn't notice that the packets of seeds in her pocket had started to spill. And as she ran along the muddy road, the seeds were spilling out, and the rain was falling down onto them. And this witch, who did not know so many spells, started to move her hands and said, you've stolen my carrots! But the way that she spoke, she tripped over her tongue, and the girl did not know it. But as she moved her fingers, the spell that she'd made was not for a carrot, it was for a parrot. And the rain started to fall down, and the girl with the long hair was starting to feel that her hair was getting wet, and it was seeming to be so dark and blue on her face. Blue hair. And then she looked at her hands, but her hands were now like wings on her back. For that witch, who did not know so many different spells, had turned the girl with a beak on her face into a parrot. The girl squawked, "You have turned me into a parrot! Please turn me back!" Now, this was the first time that she'd ever said, "Please." And the witch looked and said, "No, you stole from me. I'm going to leave you as a parrot until you can start to be good inside of your heart and not so mean and not so cross and not such a terrible girl." The girl looked. "You're going to leave me like this for how long?" "I'm going to leave you like a parrot until the carrots have popped out of the ground." The girl didn't know how long that would be, but the rain came down and the sun shone, and it didn't take 1 day or 5 days or 10 days. It took weeks and weeks, and the girl would always squawk, squawk around the witch and plead and beg to be changed back into a girl. She would look, she would wish, she would want those carrots to be round and orange and juicy. But after a few weeks, the carrot tops were tall, and the witch came and pulled them out of the ground, and soon they were as orange as her beak and as long as your hand. The witch looked at the girl, who was now a parrot, and said, "Well, have you learned your lesson?" The girl squawked, "Yes, I have learned my lesson. Please turn me back." And quicker than a wink or a blink of an eye, the girl was there yet again. The girl had learned her lesson. She said to the witch, "Please, would you please show me how to grow things? It seems to be like magic." And the witch smiled. "Oh, I will show you how to grow things." And here she took some seeds and put them into the soil. She patted them down and put more soil on top. And the rain came down and the sun would shine. And the girl learned her lesson, not just to be good and not to steal things, but she learned her lesson how to grow things. And it seemed that everything that she touched would grow tall and strong and straight out of the ground. And the girl became a woman and became the best gardener that ever lived. But she would always say, when she was asked how could she grow things so well, she would say, "It's a bit like magic." It was a huge city, and he had travelled a long way to get to this place. In fact, he'd been to many different places to try and see a place that where he'd find himself, that he was happy. But inside of this wide city, he was happy. He was a kind man, tall and good, and I've got to tell you, he was sitting down to eat. And the thing that he loved to eat better than anything else was boiled and buttered cabbage. He would eat it. He would feel it on his tongue and his teeth and loved the way that it tasted. And as he was sitting down to the best meal that he'd ever had all day, there was a knock on the door. Now, this knock on the door was from a man, an old man who had white hair that stuck up from the top of his head. He stood there and said, I've heard tell that you have travelled to lots of different places. You have been all over the world. I was born in this city. I have stayed in this city. I have worked in this city, and I have never been anywhere. Please, would you tell me some of the stories of the places that you've been? The kind man forgot all about wanting to eat the rest of his boiled and buttered cabbage. Just smiled and said, of course, if you're interested and you really want to hear my stories, then I will tell you of the places that I've been and the things that I've seen and the things that I've done. He had lots of stories to tell. Stories about being on the sailing the seven seas, places he'd been and things that he'd done and things that he'd seen. And I've got to tell you that the old man with his hair that stuck up so high on his head didn't wait for a second, for he took a pen and he wrote down all of the stories that the kind man would tell him. Great stories, fine stories, stories about places he'd been and things that he'd done and things that he'd seen. And all of these stories were taken. The stories were taken and they were cut up and they were placed inside of a book with the drawings that the old man had done, with the things that he'd written and the things that he'd done. They were all cut out and stuck inside of a book. And I'll tell you this, everybody wanted to read that book. The book from the kind man about the things that he'd seen and the things that he'd done and the places that he'd been. And I read that book. And I would sit down and I would gasp at all of the things that I would read about places, about things that happened, about the way that people were in different parts of this world. I have sat down and I have read that book. And I love the stories that I can read. And perhaps one day you could read that book yourself. Of anywhere in the whole of this wide world that he could have been, he would not have chosen anywhere else than where he was right now. There was a river that flowed fast and slow as the rain would fall and the sun would shine and the wind would blow, and he loved to be by the side of this river. But here's the thing, by the river there were trees, and by the trees there was a farm. A huge farm, and that was where he lived and he worked. He loved this place very much. He would love to see the fish in the river. But one day this tall and strong man looked and he couldn't believe it, because there he saw in the water there were bottles, there was litter, there was rubbish. There were all kinds of different kinds of chemicals that had been poured into the water. And as the days went by the side of his farm, he could see that there weren't as many fish. And the cows and the sheep wouldn't come down to drink the water, for it tasted terrible. And he wondered what could be done about this. Now, he decided, even though he was sad, it started to make him feel angry inside of his heart. And he decided that he was going to try and find out just what was making the water so bad. He followed the river upstream, and then he came to where there was a huge round factory. Now this factory was huge and round, and outside of it there stood the owner of the factory, and he had golden buttons on his coat. "Just what do you want with me, sir?" said the factory owner to the farmer. The farmer was very angry, but he decided that he wasn't going to shout. He looked and he said, "It is your factory, that is putting all of the different things into the water that is killing the fish on the farm that I love so much. Well, what do you want me to do about it? Well, you need to change the way that you do things in your factory so that you don't put the rubbish into the water, that you don't pour the chemicals so that the fish can't breathe or eat or live. I don't care, said the factory owner, and he rubbed at his buttons and polished them just a little more. Now go away from me. That night, the factory owner sat down to his table, and the thing that he liked to eat better than anything else was fish. But he looked. There were potatoes, and there were carrots, and there were peas, but there was no fish. He shouted to his wife, "Wife, where is my fish?" His wife said to him, "I'm sorry to say, but when I went into the town, there were no fish to be had." It was then that the factory owner realised that what the farmer had said was right. And he started to cry, to think that all of the things that he did inside of the factory were killing the fish. And he couldn't eat the fish that he liked. He decided that he was going to change his ways. And he changed the way that he worked inside of the factory. And there weren't as many chemicals that went into the river. He made sure that rubbish wasn't placed into the water, so that when the rain fell, the water would be fresh. And soon the farmer saw that there were a few more fish in the river. And the farmer was pleased, and so was the factory owner, because he could have fish for his tea. The farmer went back up the stream, went up to the factory owner, and he had a smile on his face that was as big as a banana. "Thank you very much," said the farmer. "Thank you very much for changing the way that you do things in the factory. I know that we can't stop factories from working, but we can try and make sure that there are fish in the water." The two of them, the farmer and the factory owner, worked as hard as they possibly could, and the factory owner still had fish for his tea, and the farmer definitely had a smile as big as a banana. He loved the way that his beautiful shoes looked. He was walking through the middle of this rich town, and the boy was rich himself. That was one of the things that he liked about this place. There was a smell that hung about the town, but it was sweet and cloying and sugary. It was the smell of all of the flowers, because that was the way that this town had made its money. And on this springtime morning, this boy was walking along. Now, he was a bad boy because he thought that anyone who didn't have as much money as him was not as good as him. And he would say so without waiting to think. As he was walking through the town, he looked and he saw that there was a girl. Now, the girl was down on her hands and knees, and she was sweeping by the flower beds. She was poking at the ground so they could put more flowers into the soil, so that when the rain would fall and the sun would shine, the flowers would all grow. But she was in between him and where he wanted to go. He just spoke to her and said, "Get out of my way." Not a very pleasant thing to say at all, now is it? Get out of my way. And the girl just kept on sweeping, and she had a smile on her face, and she looked up and said, "Excuse me? Are you talking to me?" "Of course I'm talking to you," said the boy. "Oh, really? I just wasn't sure." She stopped her sweeping, and she dropped the brush from out of her hand, and it was then that the boy saw that she had in her hand a magic wand. She waved it once and twice and 3 times in the air, and touched him once on his head, once on his shoulder, once on his other shoulder. And he looked, and nothing happened. Nothing happened. His voice sounded not the way that it had before. Look, and when he tried to speak, his voice scraped and scratched in the air. "What have you done to me?" he said. "What have you done?" The girl looked at him and said, I've done nothing to you except what you do to other people, because it doesn't hurt to say please and thank you." "Well, I never say please and thank you," said the boy, and his voice scraped and scratched in the air, and every time he tried to speak, there was a terrible noise that rattled and echoed. "What have you done to me?" said the boy. "I've just done to you what you do to other people. You speak unpleasantly because that's the way that you are. And until you can learn to say please and thank you and be kind and generous, you will always speak like that." And every time he opened his mouth, there would be this terrible scraping, scratching noise. He didn't speak to his mother and father that night in case they heard his voice. His mother and father were quite pleased because he was always complaining. The next day, he looked at the girl, and he never used please and he never used thank you. And still he spoke in that scratchy kind of way. But after about 4 days, he could not stand it anymore. He looked at the girl, and she was expecting that of his voice. He looked and he said, "Please." And there was no scrit and scratch. "Please." And he was quite surprised. "Please, please, I'm sorry for what I did." And he never said please, or sorry, or thank you before. And now he realised that if he was to say anything mean or cruel or unpleasant, then his voice would start again. And he never did. And the two of them became friends, and the two of them would help with the flowers. And when he grew to be a man, he never had an unkind word to say to anyone. The sun was shining by the side of the sea, and the boy was running. Now, he was running away from the fact that he had called so many people so many bad names. And he was running along the side of the sea, and he wondered to himself what kind of mischief he could get up to, who he could call a name today. And as he was running by the side of the sea, he looked and he saw that there was a man. Now, this man was tall and strong, and the man was running by the side of the sea, and this boy, only because he had some mischief inside of him, shouted out, "I don't like you." The man stopped in his tracks. "What do you think you're doing? You don't know me. You can't shout at me. You can't say those kind of terrible things." But the boy just laughed, because he thought, "This is really good. I've caused a lot of trouble." And the boy, well, now he'd hurt somebody else's feelings. But the sun was starting to go down, and now he was feeling cold, and he got just a little bit lost. Luckily for him, that man who'd been running by the side of the sea could see him, and he went to his car and he brought out a blanket that he could wrap around his shoulders. He said, "You need to be careful. It's a good job I'm kind, and I've forgiven you for calling me a name and shouting out terrible things to me. Now, where do you live? And I'll find a policeman to take you back home." Well, the boy spoke about where he was, but I'll tell you this, that man who'd been running saw the boy again the very next day, still shouting and calling people names. He wondered how the boy would feel if someone was to do it to him. Now, this boy was very good at football, and he was playing football on the field by the side of the school, and the tall man who'd been out running saw him, and when the boy scored a goal, everyone else shouted hooray, but the tall man said, "I remember you. I remember you. You called me names, and even after I'd helped you, you still called people names. And I think I'm going to have a word with your teacher." The boy was starting to feel a little bit frightened, and at half-time, when everyone was having a drink, the tall man said to the teacher, "Do you know that that boy that you say is such a good footballer, well, he's good at something else. He's good at upsetting people and making them cry and calling them names." The teacher was not pleased. She asked to talk to his parents, and they weren't pleased either. They tried to do the best with the boy, but when they'd found out that he'd been calling people names and making people upset, they were not happy. The boy knew that he had to learn his lesson, to stop calling out, to stop calling people names. And he did learn his lesson. And I'll tell you this, the next time that he played football, everyone was pleased that he'd scored a goal, including the tall man, because he could see that he'd learned his lesson and would say good things and kind things to people. And even when that boy grew up to be a man, he was the best footballer in all of the world, and everyone would say about him, do you know something about him? He hasn't got an unkind word to say to anybody. He's the kindest person that we know. And when he heard this, I've got to tell you, he would smile and he would remember that it's not a good thing to hurt people's feelings, that it's not a good thing to make people cry, and it's not a good thing to be unkind.